Hi, the Mudbrooker here. Today I'm going to step up my wood stove baking a bit, and I'm going to make some braided top sourdough bread. I've done this recipe before, but I'm going to show it to you again, and this time around I'm going to bake it in my wood stove. Before we get started, I would like to thank my patrons on Patreon: Kay's Kist, Benedict Riggers, Joy Jones, Damian Bayer, Leo, Theodore Engelke, Valentin Toman, Rudy Belvano, Key Osby, John Wheeler, Sherry Lynn, CJ, and Sarah. I greatly appreciate your support, and it goes a long way to helping this channel along. In your honor today, I'm going to have a bit of Bailey's Irish Cream. And thank you once again. Well, let me get the camera moved around to the counter, and I'll show you how to make this sourdough bread. Before we dive into the bread making, I'm going to show you a little tip that I learned the hard way about sourdough starter that you're going to store in your fridge for a while. Once you have a well-established sourdough starter, they're really pretty resilient. You can neglect them for quite a while, and I usually only feed my starter every 3 or 4 weeks. That allows a layer of this brownish liquid to form on top. That's called hooch. It's basically alcohol from the fermentation process that the microbes in the sourdough starter produce. But I used to just, when I fed my starter, I used to just mix it right up in the jar and scrape the sides down, put it in the fridge. Luckily I had split my starter and had some for storage in the fridge and some that I was using pretty regularly. And what happens when you scrape the sides down, you still leave bits of starter up on the sides of the jar, and that has a tendency to mold after a few weeks, and I lost half of my sourdough starter because it molded. But if you mix up your starter when you feed it in a separate dish and carefully pour it into a jar so that you don't get anything on the sides, this is where the level used to be before it consumed the starch in there and turned it into alcohol. If you make sure the sides of your jar are clean, it's much less likely to mold because that layer of hooch has enough alcohol in it that it will act as a preservative and keep the mold from growing. And that little bit there is still moist from the alcohol, so it doesn't grow mold. So that's just a little helpful tip. I'll stir this back into my starter, and I'll explain a little bit more about how exactly I'm doing this sourdough. It's a little different than a traditional sourdough. But anyway, let me get my camera on the tripod and we'll get on with making bread. The sourdough bread that I'm making could probably actually be best called a sourdough flavored bread, because I'm not using the starter to provide the rise in my bread. I'm using it more just for flavor, and there's a good reason for that. I'm going to make braided top bread, and normally with a sourdough you would make up your dough, allow it to rise the first time, punch it down, and then put it in the refrigerator to rise overnight so that it could slowly develop the big gas bubbles and allow the dough to ferment like a traditional sourdough bread. But I don't have that luxury with this particular recipe, because if I did that, after I braided it and then put it in the fridge, the braids would simply sink down into the dough and you'd lose all the detail and it'd be a waste of effort. So if you're into sourdough and you need to feed your starter, a bread like this is good because you can use the liquid that you would be pouring off normally when you fed your starter to make some bread. And I'll feed this after I'm done. There's a lot of other videos on YouTube about care and maintenance of sourdough bread, so I'll just leave that to them to explain. But we start off with turning my scale on. Most sourdough recipes go by weight rather than by volume, so I'm going to be weighing all my ingredients. Come on, zero, you silly scale. And I start off with 350 grams of sourdough starter. Get that in there. 335. Oh, there we go. Well, that's closer to 360, but it'll still work just fine. 350 grams of sourdough starter. If I can set this aside. Then I will add 420 grams of water, 10 grams of salt, about a teaspoon and a half of yeast. Like I said, I'm using yeast to provide the rise in this bread rather than relying on the starter to do it for me, which means I can have this done in a reasonable amount of time too. And then I will stir in 800 grams of flour. I'm just going to give this enough of a stir to wet down the flour so I don't get a big cloud of flour dust when I put it on the mixer and start kneading it out. That should be good enough. Now I might need to adjust the amount of flour in here because I want this to be a little less sticky and soft than a normal sourdough dough would be, because I need to work with it later when I'm braiding it. So that's wet down alright. Set him aside, grab my dough hook, and I'll put this on the mixer on low speed until it comes together as a ball. And once it does that, I will knead it for about another 7 or 8 minutes after that, and then we can get on to the next phase of our process. Alright, this has come together into a ball good, and it's cleaned off the sides of the bowl nice, but it's still a little bit stickier than what I needed for my purposes. So I'm going to give it a couple of tablespoons of flour, not a whole lot, and I'll let this knead in, check it again a little bit, and then I'll let this knead for, like I said, 6 or 7 minutes until it's nice and smooth. Alright, this has been kneading for about 8-9 minutes. I did have to tweak it a bit with the flour. By the time all was said and done, I ended up adding probably about 1/3 of a cup, maybe a little bit more, because I have to get this to the point where it won't stick to my hands. And seeing as how I got there, probably could have been a little bit drier, but I think we'll still be okay. Now, what I need to do is dump this out. Come on, you, get out. And it is a little bit sticky, but it'll still work. Dump this out, set it aside, and then grease my pan. Just use the same bowl that I mixed it up in, and I'll let this rise for an hour or so until it at least doubles. It'll depend on how warm it is in the room you're rising it in, how long exactly it'll take. I'll let this rise good, and then we'll get on with the braiding part. I'll give it just a little knead to form it into a ball. Kind of pinch the bottom shut a little bit. Throw her in there. Flop it around some so that it gets a little bit of butter on all of it. Then I'll cover it up, leave her sit for an hour, and we'll be back then. My dough is risen and it's ready to be punched down, and it still feels a little bit sticky. So what I'll do is I'll knead a little bit of flour, a little bit more flour, into the portion that I braid before I actually braid it. But get that punched down good, and I'm going to use my, whoops, I'm going to slap my camera around. I'm going to use my nice little yellow Desco-ware casserole dish for this. You can use a Dutch oven, or if you have a big enough rectangular cast iron pan, that'll work too. For a regular sized bread pan, this is kind of a big recipe. You probably want to make 2 loaves out of it, but I'm just going to make 1 big loaf out of it. Anyhow, I'll set this aside for, well, I'll leave it there, I got room. I'll get my dough out. And I'm still going to move my camera every time I try and do something. I'll get my dough out and shape it into a nice ball, or at least a ball. And then cut it in half. Set this half aside, and this half will go into my baking dish. I'll shape it out a little bit, put it in there, and just kind of pat it down until it fills all the way out to the sides. And I don't think I'm really going to need to knead any more flour into that. The dough feels pretty good. And I'll set that aside. Hopefully not knock over my camera in the process. With the dough that I have left, I'm going to knead it around a little bit. Get it into kind of a rough log shape. Doesn't have to be perfect. And I want to cut this into 8 pieces. So I'll cut it in half first, quarter it, and then have the quarters. The braid I'm going to do for the top of my dough is an 8-part braid. Now don't let that throw you. While it sounds like a nightmarish Gordian knot sort of a thing, it's actually an extremely simple braid to make. I'm going to dust my hands a little bit, maybe a little bit on the counter. Take a lump of your dough and cup your hands like so, with a little space down to the bottom. Let a little bit poke out underneath, and then just rub your hands together and roll out a long, thin rope. This needs to be stretched out a bit more, and I'm going to shut the camera off because you probably don't want me to do this 8 times. But once I got all of my ropes done, I'll be back and I'll show you how to braid them. I've got my 8 balls rolled out into 8 little ropes. You don't have to stretch these out all at one time. After you do your first rolling out, it'll probably be about that long. You just let that sit for a minute or so while you work on the next one. Then you lay them out, and you just give them kind of a little pinch and pull, and you just keep slowly stretching them out, and eventually you'll get to something like this. You can let it rest now and then for a minute or two. It helps keep them from snapping back. Okay, I'm going to dust everything down just a little tiny bit. I'm going to move these closer together. Now the best way to think of what you're doing is not that you're doing an 8-part braid, but in fact you're working with 2 groups of 4. So I'll get these guys moved in closer. In my first group of 4, I'll kind of pinch the top end together, that's on camera, just to keep things together, and then I'll do the same thing with this bunch. Now, let me get over here. Start on your left side with the first group of 4. You take the outside strand, you pass it over the strand next to it, and then you go under the next one, over the next one, and then you go under the first strand of the next bunch, which is a little bit too far away. Okay? And then you put it back in line. Now, your outside strand of the first 4 has now become the inside strand of the next 4. Now you come back to the right side. Instead of going over the first strand, you go under, and then over, and then under, and then over, so that the outside of your right hand side is now the inside of your left. After you do a couple of turns at this, it gets to be really easy. And really easy. There you go. Now to go over this guy and under this one. And again, that becomes your next inside of the next bunch. And then we go under, over. I want to be, I already messing up a little bit. How about that? Over that one, I want to be under this guy and over that one. Over, under, over, under, under, over, under, over, over, under, over, under, under, over, under, over, and you just keep on going until you run out. Over him, under him, under and over, under and over, over. And it helps to mutter to yourself while you're doing it. And once you get down to your last bit of braiding, you just kind of pinch this whole mess together on the end and this whole mess together on this end. Now, this part can be kind of tricky. You want to find the section of your braid that looks the best. Pick the whole mess up real careful like and lay it on top of your bread. Then kind of spread it out a little bit so that it gets out to the sides. It doesn't have to go entirely to the side, but you want to get fairly close. Let me grab my knife and then trim off the end of both pieces of your braid. And set that dough aside, because we'll need that again in just a minute. Picked the sharpest knife I have too, didn't I? Anyway, you want to cut dough. And kind of straighten this out a little bit, get it organized. That doesn't look too bad. Take your extra dough, ball that all together. I'm going to run out 2 long strands with this. And I'll be back once I got them all run out. When you roll out your 2 long strands, you want to make sure that they're going to be long enough to go all the way around whatever you're using for a baking dish, because what we're going to do is take these, twist them around each other, make a rope out of it, and we're going to lay that around the inside of the baking dish, just like so. Now it's just a matter of letting this rise again for another 20 minutes and throwing it in the oven. This is going to be a challenge baking this. My fire has been fighting me every inch of the way. It either wants to take off and go like hell or die off. So we're going to see what I'm going to end up with when I get done with this. I also normally would brush this with an egg wash right before I put it in the oven, but I'm not going to do that this time because I want to see how the crust turns out in the wood oven without anything to interfere with it. So I'll be back in about 20-25 minutes and we'll get this baking up. Alright, here we go. My bread is rose in the pan a bit and it's ready to go in the oven. I don't want to keep my door open too long to show you this, but in my last video when I made the chicken and rice, some of you noticed that I'm using sat irons on the corners of my rack to keep it up off the bottom. That's because the rails are too high to put something like this in the oven, but I still want to get some temperature or some heat circulating down underneath. I'm at 350 degrees in my oven, and in my electric oven at 350 it would take about an hour to bake this because it's a fairly good sized loaf and it's a fairly moist loaf at that. It has pretty good moisture content, and hopefully I can get my fire to settle down. It's been fairly stable the last few minutes and hopefully it won't be too much of a hassle. But I'll be back in about 10-15 minutes and I'll have to turn that because all the heat comes off of the firebox side of the oven, and if you don't turn things you'll end up burning one side and having the other side nearly raw. Wish me luck with this, and I'll be back in about 10 or 15 minutes to turn this around for the first time. Alright, we're 15 minutes in and it's time to turn this for the first time. My fire seems to be stabilized fairly well, so that's good. Hopefully I can keep it there. And we'll get this guy spun around. And I think I'll move it over a little bit farther. A little farther away from the heat. Well, I'll be back in another 15 minutes and see how we're doing. Alright, half an hour in. Temperature is still holding where it should. We'll give her another spin. It's sounding kind of done, and it's shrunk up a bit, so I'm not really sure. It should take longer than that. I don't know. I'll give it another 15 minutes, and we'll see where we're at, and, you know, see where we're at, I guess. Moving back over here. It hasn't been 15 minutes yet. This has been baking for a total of about 35 minutes. But that's done. I'm going to pull that out and I'll move it over by put it on the cooling rack and let that cool off, and I'll show you what we ended up with. I don't know if you can hear that, but this is actually crackling a little bit. So I'm going to dump her out onto my cooling rack. Set that aside. It smells good. Sounds good. I think this is really done. So I'm going to leave this sit and cool off. I noticed my top kind of separated from my bottom a little bit. It doesn't usually do that, but this is the first time I've tried it in the wood stove. I'll let this cool off a bit, and I'm going to see what I end up with for a crumb. I've let this cool off for 15 minutes or so, and it's time to see what we ended up with. A very crusty crust. It is a little bit underdone inside. It's done, but I'd rather have it just a little bit more. I think next time, from what I've learned on this go around, is that I will run my oven at about 300 degrees, 325 instead of 350. A little slower oven, so that it has time to cook through more before it browns up too much. I think the reason for that is, with a conventional oven, all the heat you get is from the bottom, whether it's a gas burner or an electric element. With the wood oven and the fire circulating all the way around it, you get some fairly intense radiant heat all the way around what you're cooking, especially from the firebox side. Let's see how that crust tastes. be with you in a second. I'll get this chewed up. That crust is really good. Especially if I would have wiped this down with a little butter when it first came out of the oven. But I wanted to see what I got for a crust. I'll try a little bit off the bottom where it was down in the pan. Yeah, that's just a fantastic crust on this though. So yeah, it was a good learning experience. I'd have been really surprised if this turned out perfect the first time around, but it didn't. And I hope you enjoyed helping me learn how to make bread in my oven.